All right, so let's look at sovereignty or standoff. Danielle Smith's Alberta Gambit. And of course, we've talked a bit about this in the past, but this past Monday, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith addressed her province regarding its future within Canada after meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney last Friday, a meeting she described as positive in nature.
However, Albertans are more of a actions speak louder than words kind of people. So while I will in good faith work with Prime Minister Mark Carney on unwinding the mountain of destructive legislation and policies that have ravaged our provincial and national economies this past decade, until I see tangible proof of real change, Alberta will be taking steps to better protect ourselves from Ottawa. As a start, I will soon appoint a special negotiating team to represent our province in negotiations with the federal government on the following reforms requested by our province. We hope this will result in a binding agreement that Albertans can have confidence in. Call it an Alberta Accord, if you will. First, Alberta requires guaranteed corridor and port access to tidewater off the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic coasts for the international export of Alberta oil, gas, critical minerals, and other resources in amounts supported by the free market, rather than by the dictates and whims of Ottawa. Every province in the country, other than Alberta and Saskatchewan, have coastal port access, and no province needs it more given the size and value of our resources. This will benefit all Canadians to the tune of trillions of dollars of economic activity, including billions for First Nations partners. Second, the federal government must end all federal interference in the development of provincial resources by repealing the No New Pipelines Law, C-69, the oil tanker ban, the net zero electricity regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, the net zero vehicle mandate, and any federal law or regulation that purports to regulate industrial carbon emissions, plastics, or the commercial free speech of energy companies. These laws are destroying investment confidence and costing Canada and Alberta hundreds of billions in investments each year. They need to go. Third, the federal government must refrain from imposing export taxes or restrictions on the export of Alberta resources without the consent of the government of Alberta. Frankly, all provinces should be given that same respect for their resources. And fourth, the federal government must provide to Alberta the same per capita federal transfers and equalization as is received by the other three largest provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. We have no issue with Alberta continuing to subsidize smaller provinces with their needs, but there is no excuse for such large and powerful economies like Ontario, Quebec, BC, or Alberta to be subsidizing one another. That was never the intent of equalization, and it needs to end.
So I do want to throw in a couple of things. The 10% figure for eligible voters, that's down from 20%. That's an amendment to the existing law that I believe has now been passed by the legislature. The other thing of it is when you listen to those four demands that she's put in front of Prime Minister Carney, and in response to the 10 years that the Trudeau government and his environment minister really dumped all over the resource-based industries, particularly oil and gas in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. I don't have a real argument against what she's asking for. I think what she's asking for is fair. And I also like how she brought in changes are needed to the equalization formula, because it does. She's right. It makes no sense for Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec, the largest economies in the country, to be shoveling money back and forth to each other under the equalization formula. She also made it very clear that she doesn't have an issue with Alberta contributing to equalization payments for smaller provinces. She gets what is involved in that respect.
That's what it was intended for.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
But somehow it has come around, and why would a province as rich as Alberta or Ontario, Quebec, Quebec is a resource-based economy as well, and British Columbia. Why would we be receiving equalization payments or anything associated with the equalization formula? It makes absolutely zero sense. So I don't argue with what she's saying. She's also seems to have tempered her views as to saying she wants a sovereign Alberta in a united Canada. And she's not the only premier who has pushed for more sovereignty at the provincial level. I mean, God knows she's taking a page right out of the playbook of Quebec.
Absolutely.
And I'm surprised that other provinces haven't done this long before this.
Well, I'm surprised that Alberta is only pushing this issue seriously now. I mean, a resource-rich province like Alberta not doing this in 1980, 1985, 1990. I'm just astounded. I mean, there was talk of it, especially when Preston Manning was in charge and wielding his ways out west. What took them so long? I'm kind of mixed in terms of anytime you hear the word sovereignty, or in Quebec, Sovereignty Association, and so on and so forth. Considering what we went through here in Quebec, it's tough to hear. But I clearly understand where she is coming from in terms of what she asked Prime Minister Carney for in order to keep her interests and keep her constituent interests and keep the industry interests in Canada as opposed to just Alberta specific. So I'm in agreement for what she's asking for. I just have a hard time hearing that word sovereignty and listening to that word sovereignty objectively, being a Quebecer and seeing the devastation of what the proposition of sovereignty did to this province in terms of its economy, which I think is going to take a long time longer to recover. I mean, don't forget, 1976, Canada was the financial center of all of Canada, not even close anymore, all because of the politics, and you know what that was all about. So, you know what? Yes, they certainly took it out of Quebec's playbook. It seems like it, but be very, very careful of what happens once you light that match and you try to put it out with your fingers, which can invariably happen to Alberta if the population decides to go down the referendum route. You're looking at international business potentially just drying up completely. How many companies may, pull stake and move out? You don't know. I mean, albeit in Quebec was somewhat different because of the language laws here. A lot of organizations left. We just don't know what this potentially might mean for the mighty province of Alberta if they choose to go down the sovereignty path. So, you know what? If she and Prime Minister Carney can strike an agreement that those main points, her objectives for the province of Alberta, are met, and you know what? She's absolutely right. I think Albertans, and as a matter of fact, most provinces in Canada, they don't like words. They like to see action. So if Carney can come up with an action plan and actually drive it as opposed to just lip service, I think this whole threat of sovereignty might become a moot point if he actually delivers, which is some of the things that the Conservative Party promised to give Alberta anyway. So if he can pull it through, brownie points for him. And I think that'll unify Canada, further unify Canada, and also bring Alberta on board much more so than he felt on board for years. 10 years is probably an understatement, probably more than that. So you know what? I have trust and faith that Mr. Carney can bring Premier Smith to the table and agree to A, B, C, and D, and it'll be done by this time. That's what she's looking for. She's looking for A, assurances. B, she's actually looking for action. And C, Gary, get that darn pipeline established from coast to coast. We have one of the largest refineries in the East Coast in New Brunswick waiting to refine Canadian oil. We have to get it there. Quebec's got to get on board. Let's move forward.
Well, you get no argument from me on that aspect of it. The grievances that she brings up, those 4 points, you can trace it right back to Justin's father, Pierre Trudeau, back in the 70s when he dumped all over Alberta and the oil industry. And if you recall, nationalized it at the time.
Right.
Much to the dismay of Albertans. So, there has been this undercurrent that's just been bubbling just under the surface for a number of years. And the last 10 years of Justin Trudeau and his environment minister have not been kind to Alberta, to Saskatchewan, to British Columbia, to most provinces right across the country in various ways. So I get it. And I, as I say, don't disagree. The only area where I have any disagreement with is giving the provinces more autonomy on healthcare and education. I think there are some things when you're in a federation that eventually the federation has to take full responsibility for those particular items for the greater good. And when I say the greater good, to ensure that there is an acceptable level of service maintained from coast to coast to coast across this country. We're not seeing that in healthcare at the moment, and we're not seeing that in education either. So I think as much as I understand they feel they should have it, the provinces have not done a great job with healthcare and education in the greater scheme of things. And it's nearly impossible or really very, very unsettling for a family or an individual or a couple to move from one province to another in this country and not get the same level of education or not get the same level of health care that they had in the province they had just left.
Right.
The differences would amaze you. So I think as part of the responsibility of being part of the Federation and for the greater good of all Canadians, I think that things like healthcare and education in particular, and also resources and the movement of resources has to become a federal government responsibility. The movement and security of our resources, oil, potash, and even electricity.
Right.
We're selling electricity to the U.S. or across from province to province. I think that in order to maintain a certain level of service and quality of service, I think that, and because of the security involved, now you can't argue against the fact that national security is involved when you're dealing with oil and natural gas and potash and electricity and water. These are national security issues and therefore should come under the responsibility of the national government, the federal government in Ottawa. That's how I see it. And we have a question if anybody wants to chime in. Is Alberta's sovereignty push a legitimate demand or a political distraction? So let us know what you think about that. Eddie?
Well, I got a question for you. I got a question for you, Gary. I mean, aside from Aside from Premier Smith's demands, and I think a lot of Canadians would agree with it, Albertans certainly agree with it. I know Quebec is looking very closely at those questions. Aside from that, aside from the wording of using the word separation and sovereignty, let's just put that aside. What do you think about the timing of all this? I'm not sure about the timing of all this, and is it good timing? Is it bad timing, considering what we're going to be up against if Trump continues in his worldly ways? What do you think about the timing of all of this pressure?
I think if you're Danielle Smith and anybody in Alberta who even has a notion of some kind of separation or whatever you want to call it, increased sovereignty, I think the timing is great. I think the timing for the discussion on those 4 areas that she outlined in the clip we played is ideal, because we have an almost new government. You know, we have some of the same people from the Trudeau era, but they were distancing themselves from Trudeau. So, you have to give them full marks for that. And we have a new prime minister who wants to share and start moving on his new economic vision for the country. Mm-hmm. And so if we're going to move in that direction, and if Prime Minister Carney is serious about this, then I think he has to be open to the ideas, for example, that Smith did present. I think her timing, and here we are, we've almost been caught with our pants down with the tariffs being thrown at us, because we are so heavily tied to the U.S. in that market. So, we really do need to diversify our trade. And part of that, and as she says, as she said, they don't have access to Tidewater, direct access to Tidewater for shipping oil and natural gas offshore.
Her only source of business is the United States right now, is it not?
Basically, they are shipping some natural gas, I think, through to BC, and I believe they are shipping some oil to the refinery in St. John. The refinery in St. John can handle the heavy oil. Right. And of course, we all remember a very tragic event here in Quebec a few years ago, where a whole trainload of that oil went charging into a small town and basically obliterated it. And that was oil bound for St. John by train, because we don't have a pipeline going through to the refinery in St. John. Yeah. So, if the political element in Quebec didn't learn from that disaster, that tragedy, and our national government didn't learn from that tragedy, really, what hope do we have in some respects? But we do have a new start. We have a new leader who has not come up through the political realm as such, and has a slightly different approach, a fresh approach to maybe we're going to actually see the country run in on a more business-like platform. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I hear you, Gary. And you know what, personally, I think she's a strong premier, a very strong premier, probably one of the strongest Alberta has had in a while. Very sharp, I think, to be respected and to be feared. She backs her constituents up, come hell or high water. She listens to her constituents. I would have preferred if she continued to have those discussions with Prime Minister Carney in terms of what her demands are for her province. No question about it. No better time than now. I think, and I won't call it rhetoric, or I'll use rhetoric for a lack of a better word, sovereignty, separation, that type of ideology, changing the bill in Alberta as opposed to 20%, just to have 10% of her public sign a petition to move towards a referendum question, which is a political move, of course, to get what they were looking for in reducing it to 10%. She could have waited 2 or 3 months. I don't think 2 or 3 months to allow Canada to get its plan through in terms of free cross-border trade across all provinces as a priority, A, and B, for Canada to remain united in its efforts against the Trump regime and dealing with these tariffs and renegotiating our trade agreements with other countries that want to do business with Canada and countries that we want to purchase from. I think she should have shown better judgment and waited 3 or 4 months at least before starting the sovereignty or the separatist question and driving towards that. It wouldn't have made a big difference one way or the other in terms of the viability of Alberta, because she's having those discussions under 4 key points as to what she'd like to see for Alberta. So in my opinion, Gary, I think she could have waited. I don't know what she was doing in terms of posturing. Is this something that was agreed to with her recent visits down to Mar-a-Lago? I don't know, but I think she could have waited, and it wouldn't have hurt Alberta at all. It would not have hurt them at all.
Well, the other side of it is that it did come off a meeting she had last Friday. I mean, this was boiling before this, but
right.
The Prime Minister met with her last Friday, and both of them said it was a good meeting and a good start to things. And so she, the pulse has been, kind of boiling along as to some of the Western separation again, the Alberta separation talk. Yeah. So it's out there. So to me, it's kind of pulling everything together. And because you have this new start, jumping in and at least laying out, if nothing else, talking points, right? Now, the change to the legislation, bringing it from 20,000 to, or 20% to 10%. Yeah. That could have waited. No question. That could have waited. But maybe it was designed to be, we're talking, yes, but also, a little nudge of the elbow to the ribs. Prime Minister, we are making, setting it up for the people who are pushing in this direction to address this at some point sooner rather than later. So,
yeah, but cutting it down to 10%, I mean, think about that. I mean, the lower you go, the more radical,
the easier it is.
The bottom 10% to get what you need, right? I mean, look at the United States of America. The bottom portion is always the more radical element of any sort of democracy. So, I mean, going to 20%, which will provide you more of a mix of people in terms of getting that 20%. Now you're basically refining that to only a 10% requirement. And you know what? Most of the radical thoughts and thought thinking processes, the people that are saying let's make Alberta a 51st state or let's join the United States, you're going to find those in that 10%. So it'll be much easier to get the referendum question on the table with just 10% requirement. So I call it gerrymandering, call it what you want, but I think this was a little underhanded, if you ask me. On the other side of it, let's get it on the table, boom, and move on and see where it goes. At least she's playing to the malcontents and giving them something to chew on. But there's also like a series of town hall meetings planned for across the province. I believe it's this fall, and roundtable discussions and so on. So there's a lot more involved than just even making that change as far as from 20% to 10%. So Elizabeth writes, what was Trudeau doing for the country?
Elizabeth, there's a lot of us that are scratching our heads and asking the same question, and we don't have an answer other than driving it into the ground.
Yeah.
And setting us up the way that he did by hanging around far too long. Anyway, Elizabeth says, I have a friend that left BC and moved back home to Montreal, where she was raised, and is having the hardest time with her disability. It's been over 1 year. Shameful. The hardest time with her disability.
Yeah, I think she that left BC and she came back to Montreal. So she's having a hard time with our medical system here in Quebec.
Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Gotcha. And I can understand that. It's
very
rather,
shameful.
Yeah, it's daunting for sure.
Well, it goes to the point, that goes to your point in saying that healthcare should be controlled right across the board, across all provinces by the Canadian government to ensure uniformity across all provinces and all territories, right?
Yeah. Totally.
I'm sorry to hear that, Elizabeth.
Joe says Alberta sovereignty may be a moot point if T. Rump was to act on his threats. Yeah. Good point there. And Monel says she could have given him a chance before flying off the handle like that. I'm dropping the separation word. I hate that word. I agree with Eddie. Very, very bad history there. Oh, yeah, no question there's bad history. No question there's bad history. But, it's something that we have to deal with. And part of it is, again, the federal government losing its way along. Yeah. And it's drifting and focusing on these wild green schemes and all of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes with a whole bunch of controversies that have, since surfaced. So, yeah. Joe says, cutting off your nose to spite your face. Don't like our home and native land. You're free to leave. Take O'Leary and PP with you. Good one, Joe.
Joe, we're going to find some way to move some Moosehead beer from East Coast to you. BC. Nice one.
Wow, right in, direct hit. Take no prisoners.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good one.
All right. So, well, certainly we'll be keeping our eye on these roundtables and discussions, the town hall meetings that they're planning in Alberta. And again, sometimes the federal government needs that little bit of elbows up, boom, to get them moving on some things. Oh.